128 different
128s, but 128 isn't. Like 128s are 128. So
128. Just
128s. Now 128. This 128 in 128 samples.
128s. These 128 samples. And 128 is 128 mid or 128 options.
In 128s and
It's 128, right?
128 since 128 is in 128s or 128s. Check.
128 sample.
128 different 128 free.
128 and 30.
And 128s for
128 samples.
128 samples. 128.
It was 128 samples, 128 different.
128s for 128 simpler.
128. So
128. You'll 128 samples.
128s
128 sample.
128 loops, 128 loops.
128 LGIC 128
do 128. Hold
128 samples.
128. Damn it.
In 128s, 128 versus 128. But
128.
Means 128 samples.
128 sample, 128 different.
128.
128s new.
128.
128, like 128 different.
128s and
128 is 128.
128 sample and 128, right?
In 128s and in a 128.
128, I put 128s for
128s.
128s, 128 loops.
128s to 128. Now, 128, what, how, 128 sample, and 128 sample, 128, but
128 sounds.
128, so in 128, right? And these
128, but
for 128, right? And 128, right? But
128 samples.
these 128s, right? For 128. So
these 128s.
I mean 128s or
128s and 128. So 128 samples, 128.
128 is 128 cells.
128 of 128 sample. 128s. This 128s.
128s and 128s. If you 128s built.
Like 128 and
128 rack.
128.
So 128 different.
like 128. Now, in 128s and 128s. Rhythmic 128s versus 128s. And
128's concept, 128 synths. 128's think 128 chain.
128.
128s with
128 drum.
128s are 128 full 128.
228 and 128. But
128, so 128.
There's 128 differently 128 cells. 128 and 128. So 128 different. 128 kick 128 and
128 slice.
128 other 128 sample.
128. It's 128s. Now 128. So we're going to create a new multi-sample again. And 128s are 128 for
128s, right?
128 sample.
128 parts.
128 of
128 samples. 128 kicks. 128 clap.
128 up.
128s then 128s that.
that's 128. So 128. So
128, right?
a 128. That's 128's the
128, exactly 128.
128. With 128. It's
128, whatever, 127, 120, or 127, 128 kick.
128 sample.
128s and
128.
This 128 sampler.
128s are 128s, but 128 with 128. Now 128 and 128 is 128. Slice
128s or
128s.
So 128 different 128 sample. 128, but
Do 128 because 128 is 128 kits.
128 sample.
128s and 128s.
128. If 128s are
128 sounds.
128 different 128 and 128 samples.
That's 128 keys.
128 and 128s that
128 power.
128 different.
128s, right?
128s.
for 128. However,
128 sample. 127. And
128.
128.
128s for
128 usable.
128s today. 128s are 128s and
128 sounds.
a 128 Right. At least 128, or drag 128 sample, 128. So
128 for
128 sample.
128's just
128 sample.
128s, which 128 sample 128. So
128. And
128's for
128. There's 128, so 128. And 128 sample
of 128 kicks.
128 and 128, well, 128 different
128, selectors.
128s or 128s. Check
128 of
128 slot and 128 of
128 slice 128s and 128s on.
128s, Greek 128 sample.
128s, so
128, 100, 17.
128 different.
128 from
128, 128s, 128.
128 of 128 of
128's quick.
Make 128 friendly.
128 sample.
128s in
128s, right?
Make 128.
128 samples, 128 sample.
128.
And there's 128 sample.
128s. If
128 sample, 128. There's
128 per
128 because
128 is 128 kick. 128 is it's 128 samples. 128.
Your 128 set.
128 slots, 127, but 128.
So 128, 128 sample, 128 sample.
128.
128s. 128s are 128 sample.
128s. What?
128 save 128s. I have 128s and 128s out. 128s or
128s, whereas 128. So 128 stuff.
Or 128 from 128s of
128.
128 racks.
128ths even.
128.
Make 128 into
128. The 128 sample. For 128. For 128.
128.
So 128. So these
128, you can
make 128 all
or 128s if like 128 kick.
a rhythmic 128. Then
128 different.
128. 128 better. 128 here.
128 and
128s of
128, almost
128.
Saying 128s, it's 128s.
make 128. All
128s.
128s. What?
120.
128, especially 128 is like 128 like
128 different.
128th note. 128th note.
128 here is 128s.
128 options. 127 is 128 options. 128 kicks.
128 rack.
128. Which
128 different 128 different 128 but
128 in 128. A 128 if 128 with
Reading 128 different 128s. So
128s. These 128 samples. And 128 is 128 mid or 128 options.